First, for most of my time here as emerging markets private equity investor, and then this year I made a role switch and joined Control Risk as head of business intelligence for the Americas. We are focused on in my part of the shop what looking at specific businesses, issues around them, or issues around partners, problem solving for issues that may come up for businesses, investors, and worth individuals. But here, this is the election stuff is above my pay grade, which is why I brought along our head of global risk analysis for the United States, or before who's in our that's a separate group and the kind of tea leaf reading analysis group of folks. So let me turn it over to Barbie.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone, really great to be here. I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of my role here today is to provide some broader context of what we're seeing in the election and likely implications before, I'm sure, a series of very smart people give far more detailed, granular analysis of specific implications. You'll forgive me, I am operating on very little sleep, and I pulled together these notes fairly quickly in a pretty, fast-moving environment. I will keep my remarks fairly brief and then be very open to answering any questions. Let's maybe start kind of with the election itself and then look forward. There are going to be obviously months of analysis among analysts like myself about what went right for Trump and what went wrong for Harris. There'll be certainly that analysis going on within the Democratic Party. I am more than happy to pontificate with the best of them, but the headline is very simple. This was a continuation of global trends. 2024 has been a record year for elections. We've had at least 64 national level presidential or legislative elections globally. 50% of the world's population has voted, or is countries are voting this year. And the consistent theme across all of these elections, or at least all of the free and fair elections, is that people don't like incumbents, right? Regardless of parties, regardless of ideologies, regardless of the issues on which these elections were fought, incumbents have struggled. We've seen often long-standing incumbents have either lost power in the UK, in France, Portugal, or seen their majorities substantially reduced in Japan, in India, in South Africa, etc. In the US, all the campaigns were fought on these US-specific issues, whether it be immigration, whether it be abortion, whether it be Project 2025 and Trump's plans, Harris trying to win specific demographic groups, female voters, by turning towards the abortion rights issue, Trump speaking about immigration, trying to appeal to young men and low propensity voters. But all the data we have so far, and there'll be more coming out, is that Trump's improvement on 2020 was pretty broad across all demographic groups. There's definitely variations, but it wasn't that a single group turned out and a single group didn't. And what this suggests fundamentally is that for all the talk of US-specific issues and the specific issues of this campaign, Trump's victory came down to the one factor that has been common across all the global elections in 2024 and indeed in 23 and 22, which is voter anger at inflation and the cost of living crisis. And this does have implications, I think, going back to the point made about the mandate for some of the things that he does and whether some of his policies, especially tariffs, which we'll come on to, are going to be inflationary. One other kind of quick aside that I think is worth noting, because I personally think is quite interesting. Much was made, obviously, of Biden's age, primary reasons he dropped out. But Trump, of course, will be the oldest president ever. He's the oldest person ever elected president. And although this hasn't fundamentally changed since, November the 4th, it's worth noting that more than half of the world's population is now led by septuagenarian men with their own unique idiosyncrasies. The US, China, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, Russia, Bangladesh, and Brazil. Statistically speaking, and not to wish ill on any of them, over the next 5 years or 4 years, there's a good chance that we see some changes of some pretty major world leaders simply because they're not finishing their term. What that means for political stability and geopolitics is definitely worth factoring into scenario planning. Okay, so now that's
Any thoughts on the health of them going into that?
Sorry?
Do you have a waiting on the health of the people going in?
You know what? I think we have, but I don't have it to hand. That's certainly something we've looked at, and I'm sure we could provide our analysis of some of that. The health of lots of these leaders, especially in the more authoritarian countries I've mentioned, is obviously a pretty closely guarded national secret. But we can speculate.
It might be useful. I know people know you, but they might not fully like how you have the source of your intelligence, right? Maybe a little word on control risks.
Of course, yeah. So Control Risk, for those who don't know it, we're a global risk consultancy. We've been around since 1975, so it's approaching our 50-year anniversary.
It's like ARS.
We actually started as a company in the kidnap for ransom business, not carrying out the kidnaps, to be clear, but negotiating the ransoms. We came out of the insurance industry, and since then we have grown, and our objective is to provide our clients with a kind of full suite of risk, of services to help them identify, understand, and mitigate risk. So that ranges from Roberta's department, which was around the due diligence and fraud investigations and understanding who you're getting into bed with, to our more security-focused side, which is less guys with guns, more journey management, site security review, site security design, crisis management, etc., to a cyber side that does everything we do in the real world, but digitally, and to my department, which is, the analysts, basically. We have a global team of analysts based across our roughly 40, I think it's 39 or something, offices around the world. All our analysts, despite me talking about the US, and you can tell from my accent that I'm not American, all our analysts typically come from, or at least are based in the countries and regions that they cover, and really do what journalists do to an extent. We maintain networks of sources, we talk to people, and then we filter all of that information through a kind of analytical framework that has been developed across our 50 years of history. So that's Control Risk broadly. Back to the election. Looking forward after the election, both candidates' campaigns were light on policy detail. I think that's kind of broadly agreed. The Trump campaign's own agenda, Agenda 47, is just 16 pages long. 2 of those pages are titles pages. And what we're going to be really looking at is his cabinet picks to give an indication of policy direction over the next few months up until the inauguration. Bear in mind that because Republicans have taken the Senate, he's highly likely to get anyone through. It's worth noting when we look at cabinet picks, Trump's control of the Republican Party is far more complete than it was in 2020, but there are still different factions with different views within that party, and who has the ascendancy will be important. There will be a lot of public attention, obviously, on potential roles for high-profile supporters, thinking Elon Musk, RK Jr., but more relevant to businesses will be the other picks. So just to kind of not go through all of them, but throw a few names out there, we're pretty confident that Robert Lighthizer will have some sort of role in the administration. Steve Mnuchin has been speculated that he could come back to the Secretary of Commerce role or take another role. Secretary of Energy, North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum has, we're hearing his name bandied about. Robert O'Brien possibly as Secretary of State. It's also, in terms of Trump's agenda,
Where do you see Musk?
I mean, what has been said is that he will be in charge of a government efficiency commission.
Which is an oxymoron.
The details of that are obviously are very uncertain. Could be that it has fairly far-reaching powers to have some role across.
An ombudsman? A cabinet without a portfolio?
You could see something like that. Yeah, I mean, Musk himself has spoken about cutting $2 trillion from government expenditure. I don't quite see where that's coming from. But yeah, it's an interesting one.
I'm sorry, Secretary of Energy from DC.
So we're not saying anything with certainty, but we would say that one of the names we've heard for Secretary of Energy is Doug Burke, the North Dakota governor, and who was, by all accounts, Trump's favorite VP before he was persuaded to go with Vance. I would note also, and this is old news, everyone knows this, but it is worth reading Project 2025 as an initial guide to what to expect. Trump may have distanced himself from this during the campaign because it was electorally unpopular, but many of its authors, including J.D. Vance himself, opposed to Trump. But more importantly, neither the RNC nor the Trump campaign had actually done the work to articulate a detailed policy agenda, or more importantly, to compile a list, a huge list of names for various government appointments. And we're not just talking about the cabinet here, but all the way down. The Heritage Foundation has the obvious place for the Trump campaign to go is the Heritage Foundation, which puts Project 2020.
Have you folks looked at all the possible cuts and additions or agency by agency or whatever construct to create some picture of what might happen?
We have not done that on a department by department. Yeah. No. We have given thought to kind of broad policy direction. Again, from Trump's report, from Project 2025, from Agenda 47, from what he did in his first term. Domestically, again, none of this is new and won't come as a surprise. His agenda is deregulation and tax cuts, putting aside social issues for the time being. The future of the Inflation Reduction Act, and on the basis of Mike Johnson's recent comments, potentially the Chips and Science Act, is uncertain. It will very much depend in part on the results of the House of Representatives elections, which Republicans look currently favored to gain a majority in, but it's certainly by no means definite. If they take the House, then those pieces of legislation are safe. Safe with a caveat that I'll come back to.
Sorry.
The Democrats. Even if they don't, the IRA and CHIPS Act have directed huge amounts of resources, especially in manufacturing, to Republican states. In fact, the majority of spending under the Inflation Reduction Act has been in Republican states. It may well be that there is pushback against any attempt to repeal. However, there's a lot that can be done beyond repealing. Most of the money under the IRA still has to be dispersed. The president has a lot of authority over how it is dispersed. President Trump broadly agrees with Biden on the need to secure critical minerals, develop critical minerals projects. It was, after all, his administration, his first administration in 2017, that produced the federal strategy for critical minerals that Biden has broadly aligned with. What he doesn't agree with is the more climate-focused elements of the IRA. I think foreign and trade policy is probably more interesting because for all the differences we'll see in domestic policy, that will be very, very different. The Biden administration has broadly adopted a small yard, high fence approach. What that means is quite significant trade and investment restrictions, especially with regards limiting Chinese access to technology and cutting Chinese influence out of US supply chains. But those trade and investment restrictions have been focused on a very narrow range of sectors: semiconductor chips, quantum computing, AI, those areas. And they have been extremely effective, in part because he has worked with allies, especially on the CHIPS Act and associated action and executive orders, to make sure that they serve their intended purpose of reducing Chinese access to technology and cutting Chinese influence out of supply chains. Trump, of course, again, as everyone knows, has suggested a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods, a 10 to 20% universal baseline tariff. Coming back again to your point, the inflationary impact of those means that it is at least possible, if not likely, that those are not going to be implemented as they are currently stated. But with the continued influence of people like Lighthizer, what we can say with confidence is that Trump's focus is on reducing the US goods trade deficit, and tariffs are his preferred method of doing so. So that is a very significant shift in trade policy. In broader foreign policy, the world is in an interesting place right now. US-China competition, the Israel-Hamas conflict, the Ukraine conflict. And Trump has, broadly put forward a position of less US involvement and leadership in the world, and more focus on domestic priorities. What I would say, and we can look at those specific issues, individually if you want. But what I would say is that a lot of people are asserting with great confidence what Trump will do when it comes to especially Ukraine, but also the Middle East, also China. This is a man who in his first term went from threatening nuclear war with North Korea in 2017 to holding a landmark port with Kim Jong-un in 2018. He is nothing if not unpredictable, and especially when it comes to foreign policy. If he thinks there's a deal to be made and that he can sell it as a win, he will. The range of potential outcomes on all of these issues just becomes so much wider with Trump in office. Take US-China, for example. We know that Harris would have continued broadly Biden's agenda towards China, which would have maintained tensions, but we also know that they had guardrails in place. Military-to-military cooperation was resumed under Biden at the APEC summit, and that guarded against accidental escalation in the South China Sea, for example. Under Trump, his first term, that communication broke down. The risk of accidental escalation has definitely increased, and that is bad. At the same time, I think there's a far higher likelihood also of him coming back. He has spoken fondly in many, many times. There's also a possibility of an improvement that probably wasn't under a potential Harris administration. Similar to Ukraine, most likely in Ukraine, he will do what everyone expects him to do, which is to pressure Ukraine to make a deal with Russia, likely on terms that Ukraine is unwilling to accept, and threaten to withhold or actually withhold assistance to Ukraine if Ukraine doesn't agree to peace talks with Russia on those terms. But again, I would just stress that this is not certain. The Ukraine conflict and the increase of military spending by NATO members and Europe more generally has been a massive boon to US defense companies, and they have a very powerful lobbying group. It is also worth noting, of course, that Trump has previously softened his stance when he was, not the president, about the Ukraine Sovereign Supplemental Act. It's also worth pointing out that Biden's popularity never recovered from the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and Trump is aware of that. And anything that is perceived as a loss, he will go again. So I'm not saying that we should expect wholehearted support from a Trump administration for Ukraine. What I am saying is that although the most likely scenario is that he threatens or actually withdraws aid to force peace talks, we can't be sure of that. The range of possible foreign policy outcomes just vastly increases under Trump compared to Biden and what would have happened under Harris presidency. I will pause there. As I said, I know we have a lot to get through. I am happy to take questions if there's time or not, as the case.
Let's take a couple. You've thrown like 20 issues out there.
How does China's economic problems and other problems play into how they respond to everything? And they're giving up two of their best markets right now with the trade wars.
Yeah.
How does that, and North Korea and Russia might have just given the finger and said, we're going to do what we want to do anyway. How do you see that?
I mean, I do violate China, one of its fifth principles.
Not yet, but getting close to it because they're staying in Russia. Right? If they go into Korea and get into Ukraine and get killed, then it violates China's principles. So where's China in all this with the bind they're in?
So our China team has been doing a lot of work on that. We have offices in Hong Kong and Shanghai and Beijing. I have had a lot of late night calls or early morning calls with them. We know that the Chinese government is already preparing a whole host of retaliatory tariffs and economic measures in the event that tariffs are introduced, especially the 60% tariff that Trump has threatened. But what it is also almost certain to do is take advantage of what they expect will be a US withdrawal from especially the global south. They think, but also Europe. I mean, Europe's deeply, deeply concerned about a Trump presidency. China believes that that if Trump moves ahead with his tariff plans, that they can take advantage of European discontent to start easing some of the barriers there, but also vastly increase their influence in Latin America and Africa. We did see this, especially in Africa, in the first Trump term, when multiple diplomatic and other positions across Africa, US appointees went unfilled for a very, very long time. Started to be corrected under Biden, but if I'm being completely honest, and I speak as a former African analyst for most of my career before I moved to the US, the US has fallen way behind in Africa, and China sees an opportunity there. That is their backup plan. They would like to improve relations with the US. I think they see Trump as a potential avenue to that, and in some respects, probably welcome a Trump victory more than a Harris victory. In some respects, it's tied because for all of Trump's rhetoric against China, it was actually Biden's measures, especially the Chips and Science Act and subsequent executive orders, that had a far more damaging impact on China's economy.
You mentioned European fears on U.S. foreign policy. Do you think American withdrawal from NATO is a possibility?
It's a possibility. We don't see it as likely for two reasons. One, that Congress has made it harder for the president to unilaterally withdraw. And even though, even if Republicans, as they look likely to do, win both houses of Congress, there will be enough bipartisan support for, it'll be narrow victories and you only need a few Republicans to support NATO. The second reason being that while withdrawing from NATO is a, big move, gain a lot of attention, maybe that's good, but there's a risk there for Trump. He can do an awful lot to undermine NATO, even if he doesn't withdraw, from reducing funding to stating that he wouldn't respect Article 5. Or even if he doesn't do that, there have been agreements recently on the last few years that, for example, there's been an agreement within NATO that a significant cyber attack would count as a breach of Article 5. That's a fairly new development. Would Trump respect that agreement, or in reality, or would he say he does? I mean, there's a lot that can be done to undermine it. And it's a useful, tool of leverage for him. It is true that in his first term, his threats towards NATO and complaints that other countries weren't paying their way did prompt an increase in defense spending, obviously helped by the Ukraine conflict. That's probably the bigger factor. But Trump's threats did contribute to that. And as I mentioned before, that's been a huge boost to US defense companies. That's brought a lot of money into the industry here.
So
China.
we have a lot of things we have to cover. So let's pause. I know we have lots of questions. We're very interactive, intellectually curious group. Let's go. We're gonna turn over to a different. This is really useful to help set the stage. I feel like we should do the same thing again in 2 weeks because we'll know a lot more, or at least in a month. We will do this on December 3rd. But let's turn and Olga Loy, we're gonna have you kick off for us. I don't think you have slides, but things that we were focused on 3 days ago are a bit different. You wanna?
Yes. Can you guys hear me?
Very well.
Yes, great. So I am the head of the tax group at Winston & Strawn, and I deal with a lot of private equity funds, venture capital funds, and hedge funds. So the big question that people were looking at is whether we're going to have any changes to taxation of carried interest. That was a topic that was on everybody's mind because there were a lot of proposals previously to tax carried interest as ordinary income. So It seems, and we don't know, it seems that it is possible that the taxation of carried interest will be not changed. So it will continue to be taxed at long-term capital gains rate if the portfolio company is held for 3 years or more. And also, I work a lot with companies that are funded by SBA, so SBIC funds. And a lot of those funds invest in portfolio companies that qualify as a qualified small business stock. So many of you know that if somebody, an individual, buys shares of a qualified small business stock and holds them for 5 years or more, then that individual will pay no tax on exit. So up to 10 million of gain, no tax, no federal, no state, except for California and Pennsylvania. California, understandably so, but Pennsylvania, not sure why. So that also was something that was discussed in the prior tax proposals, whether or not this is going to be changing. And proposals were that for anybody who makes over 400,000, that person would have those benefits limited. The proposal didn't go through. Carried interest still continues to qualify for QSB benefits. At least most of my clients take this position. So we expect that this will continue. But the sentiment among a lot of people, especially in the government, is that, taxes are going up no matter who wins. So we'll see where the source of the taxes is going to come from. We don't know, but those two provisions we think are going to be unchanged. That's all I've got.
Well, actually, I know you have more, but I'll leave it at that. Any questions on carried interest and or anything else? I mean, Olga does a lot of things around the world. These are not her only two issues.
Olga, yeah. Hi, Olga, it's Christine Egan from Stewart here. How are you?
Great. How are you? Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Olga's our lawyer, works with us. Question on the SBIC taxation that you mentioned. That would take an act of legislation to change, no?
Did you hear that, Olga?
Olga?
Yes, I hear it. Sorry about this. For some reason, I
No worries.
pushed the mute. So that would take an act of legislation to change.
Right.
But so, the proposals that were floating around, last year, 2 years ago, is that anybody making more than 400,000 would be limited in the amount of QSB exclusion. And there was also a proposal to make sure that carried interest that GPs receive cannot qualify for QSB benefits. So those proposals did not go through. So somebody actually has to put forth legislation and it will have to pass for those changes to be made. Yes, correct.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Peter?
Yeah, Olga, just a question. There's a lot of planning that can be done around 1202 stock and gifting. Have you heard anything as to shutting that down or?
No. Well, so here's something that I've heard is that apparently the IRS is very, very close to issuing regulations on 1202. And of course, they said it for the last 17 years, but from what I've heard that they're going to issue them anytime. So they could address some things, but they cannot change it completely. So they would have to just address and clarify, but not change it.
Just for everybody in the room, the concept is that you have a $10 million exclusion. So if you are smart, you can gift away some of that stock and you can increase that $10 million to each one of the people that are getting the stock. So it's a win-win if you have a very large gain.
Okay, let's keep it going. Yvonne, you want to share your slides? I'll turn it for you.
Sure. So great to be with everybody. I am Ivan Golden. I am a tax attorney with Taft, based in from Chicago office. We'll be talking about the sunset of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act individual tax provisions, as well as briefly about opportunity zones. So I'm sure many of us are familiar with the background, but Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was first enacted back in December of 2017, made a number of changes to both the individual and business tax provisions of the code. Most of those individual tax provisions, by their terms, are going to expire at the end of next year. And so if they are not extended, starting in 2026, a lot of individual taxpayers are going to notice significant changes, by and large, probably leading to increase in tax, although there's a lot of specifics around it. So some of the key, individual provisions that are set to expire, if you want to go to the next slide, is number one, TCJA reduced the individual rates, going from a top rate of 39.6 to a top rate of 37%, and sort of so forth through the different rates. And if they are not extended, we can expect to see those higher rates return in 2026. Likewise, the standard deduction almost doubled for this year. It's almost $15,000 for single filers and almost $30,000 for joint filers. There is a qualified business income deduction that was kind of designed to make pass-through businesses more competitive, at least from a tax rate point of view, with C corps. If you'll recall, the tax rate on C corps was reduced pretty substantially under the TCJA, and so this was designed to sort of create parity. There are a lot of kind of nuance and detail, but for those who fully qualified, there was a 20% deduction off of their what's called qualified business income, resulting in lower rates. And again, that goes away totally if it's not extended. It'll go away starting in 2026. State and local tax deduction. This is one that has been very controversial. Previously, individual taxpayers who itemized their deductions could deduct state and local taxes, so both property, income tax, etc. The cap limited the total deduction to $10,000, mainly affecting taxpayers in high tax states. Interestingly, this is one that I think even President Trump and I think Republicans are now taking a look at and may wish to eliminate this cap. So we may see this one, either allowed to expire or just end it altogether.
Just timing wise, if you could just move it force measure, not force measure, tour de force here.
Sure, fair enough. Why don't you skip ahead a couple and we can go to the,
Okay.
Where do we stand post-election? I think, prior to Tuesday, there was obviously really different paths if Democrats had prevailed versus Republicans. I think now, with Republicans very likely to have full control, both houses of Congress and the presidency, I think we can expect to see most of these provisions extended. As I said, maybe the exception would be the SALT deduction cap, which may be either allowed to expire or reworked. And then briefly, I want to talk also just about the qualified opportunity zone outlook, which is kind of a whole different program, but this was a program created during the first Trump term. It creates opportunity zones in various low-income tracts throughout the country, incentivizes investment in these zones through a combination of tax deferral and in some instances tax elimination if you hold an investment for long enough. And I think, speaking broadly, I think Republicans were pleased with the program, supportive of it, might even be looking to expand it. I think Democrats were somewhat supportive, but had questions about, was it sort of helping the populations it was designed to, or was it merely helping investors? And I think with the results of the election, we can expect, that program will certainly be left undisturbed, if not potentially expanded.
So, thanks, Ivan. I'm going to change the order, Al, because we talked about opportunity zones at your bailiwick, and we were all together, Ivan and you and me in Chicago, 2019.
That's right.
Pre-COVID.
5 years ago. Yeah.
Pre-COVID. So here we are. Since then, you've been doing deals, and how do you see the world today?
That's great. Yeah, and I'm happy just to speak. I don't know, hi, Ivan. Mark, do you have any slides? I'll just speak to just following up for a minute here. Yeah, so again, Al Puhala, Capstone Impact Investments. We're an investor, actually, and we just bought a shipyard in Mobile, Alabama, a few weeks ago with the support of the Navy as an opportunity zone transaction. So a lot of what I'm going to mention here is kind of informative over the last, frankly, 5 years of working with the Pentagon. The program for zones was always kind of had three main components. One is low-income communities need holistic investments, not just the housing, not just the job training, not just the venture communities, but basically any stage, any sector, which was very flexible. Two, the institutions who want to invest basically needed scalable ways to put money into. So it really was a kind of a self-investing, high net worth, maybe developer money, but it's a large program. Today, there's over $200 billion today in the program after only 7 years. So one of the fastest growing programs. And then thirdly, it could basically be used very, very flexibly. No approvals, no licenses, no disclosure. You could do $1 billion yourself and no one would know. So the issue was use of capital. How do I make sure when I invest it, I'm not going to lose my money? And basically what we did is we've been working with the Pentagon the last few years to put together an OZ program that would then really serve the needs of national security. So what we believe really this is a kind of a restart for the program, our ability to invest at the infrastructure level to create, in our case, production facilities for nuclear submarines, for the Columbia and Virginia class submarines that are built on the East Coast. There's a lot of work going to go around the country to build modules. So we're going to invest probably over $1 billion of OZ capital over the next few years to build that facility. And we have many more places like that around the country that we'd like to roll the program over to. So just to finish kind of the intro, this is something I think all the services are going to use: the Army, the Air Force, Space Force, SOCOM, Coast Guard. It's like, I need a thing. I'll support the thing to get built. I'll give a contract, hopefully, or at least the demand signal that I'll buy it. And I want to go kill bad guys around the world who are ganging up on it. So that's kind of the larger business model. What's good is sometimes things have to come together. The Pentagon put out a report, a 60-page report earlier this year called the National Defense Industrial Strategy, the NDIS. It's a thing, I think just in January. And it was really call to arms to the private sector saying, we need help, not just for the money that the private sector could provide in public-private partnerships, but we need the private sector juices and innovation and cadence and speed to get stuff built. And that's a really great, North Star of what has to get done. There are four components and our investment strategies to match those. One is supply chain resilience. Number two, prepared workforce, train and house them and support workforce for these new additive manufacturing, quantum, other sectors that support the DoD supply chain. Thirdly, reformed acquisition. That's on the government. They've got to figure out how to do long-term contracts, no termination for convenience, all the things that really don't allow long-term investments to be made. And lastly, economic deterrence. Make sure this is done with friendly capital and investment structures that support transparency and making sure it doesn't really provide a backdoor to the Chinese or the Russians to come in. So we've created our investment program to match the NDIS and very excited about going on offense. So maybe, Mark, that's a good intro.
So Al, your view on any changes in OZ legislation?
Yeah, well, this was President Trump's signature program in the first term. During his first State of the Union, he asked Senator Tim Scott to stand up and take a bow for opportunity zones at the State of the Union. So I know this is a very, very important program for the new administration coming in. The idea that it would at least get a 2-year extension. Right now, no new dollars can come in basically after September 2027. With K1 income, you can do it 6 months after your extension. So really the end of 26 plus the extra months for the extension, but you can hold those investments tax-free for 20 years to the year 2047. And that's today already the law and regulation. So if you can get your money in the next 3 years into the program, it can grow tax-free. And when you exit in 2047, you basically get everything, the investor holding the units in the LLCs pretty much, the LLCs holding the stock or units in the businesses, and the businesses selling assets. All of those over time are all tax-free exits. So it's a really 20-year harvesting period on a tax-free basis. I'm almost certain the 2-year extension from 26 to 28 will happen. 2 years during the pandemic really kept everything on hold. And there's a lot of bipartisan support to extend the 26 year to 28 and maybe also broaden it. There have been many proposals over the last couple of years to add rural zones, for instance, which I think politically would be very popular today, to add zones that are brownfields today. And also some of the zones, about 3%, were actually not low income. They were just added for good footprint. And if those fall off, a governor would get a chance to add a new zone 1 for 1. So I think there's going to be a lot of jiggering around to figure out, okay, how can we retool a program and really go on offense?
Okay. Thank you, Al. Stick around. We'll talk about that more. Abby from BDO, do you want to come on?
Good morning, everyone. It's your afternoon. Almost my afternoon as well. Well, so just to spearhead really off of Ivan, and even going back further than that, some input on 1202 and estate planning, talked about gifting and things like that. I have an article out in Bloomberg that came out a handful of months ago that goes really in depth with 1202 with a potential ESOP transaction and 1242 potential structuring with LLCs, and then also even differences between using grantor or non-grantor trusts. Obviously 1202 implications with that. So if you have any interest in 1202 or even a partial ESOP, that's a really good reference piece to get back to sunsetting of the TCJA and the comments about likely extension of a lot of these provisions. So kind of where do I see client or, opportunities? I work with a lot of family offices. So opportunities now that we have a little bit more certainty after the elections, I think, is to do an entity review depending on different factors of, a client or, yourselves. So when I look at entity considerations, can the business use all 20% of 199A? How many distributions are they making? Like what kind of percentage? What kind of income is coming in, capital gain versus ordinary, all these sorts of things. Because I've actually found a couple of opportunities where with the permanent C corporate at the 21% in a growth business, multi-generational family, where it really makes sense now, especially knowing that it's probably not going up, where the Democratic proposals were looking at 25-28% adjustments to the C corporate. Obviously, Trump's administration has proposed, obviously it's permanent, but even looking at 20 or 15%. So it's really fact specific, but entity choice review is a great opportunity. And then my specialty is estate business succession planning. And so looking at all of this from a gift, estate, and trust lens would be gifting still. So we're not expecting the exemption to be cut in half in 2026 based on the outcomes of the election. That said, most of my clients, it doesn't matter if they're cut in half or not, they're still subject to estate tax or anticipated estate tax. And so we're still looking at all the opportunities that are out there right now, which includes gifting to get the growth out of the state, using grantor trust. So the grantor is paying the income tax on trust assets, which is not considered an additional gift. So it gets even more growth out of the state. Doing sale transactions after the trust has been initially funded. There's a mention in here coming up, grants, things like that. So the Democrats don't like grantor trusts because of kind of the disconnect between estate tax implications and income tax implications. So it's definitely, we don't necessarily have concerns about that in the near term. But eventually that may become a talking point again, if and when the, powers that hold each office shift. So we look at that.
Just one more minute, Abby. Then we're gonna do Q&A at the end. Okay, keep going.
Sure. So the other thing with that is looking at trust situs. Trust law is state law, and you get to pick state law. Now, you have different considerations for income tax nexus, which are actually trending more taxpayer favorable. But South Dakota and Nevada, probably third would be Delaware, because not only are you getting extended duration trusts for our billion-dollar, families, but you're also getting very high levels of creditor protection, which is important as well. Now, extended duration is important because GST is actually a much bigger issue, in my opinion, than estate and gift, because you're protecting those same assets for, hundreds of years worth of generations. So picking trust situs and doing a review is important.
Excellent. Again, stick around. We're going to be very interactive here at the end. Going through, Chris, you want to, sitting in Denver, Boulder, or can't remember where you, Colorado.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. Chris Lev Kulich. I'm out in Colorado, in the suburbs of Denver. I was going to go into my office in Denver today, but woke up to a bunch of snow, and my kids got a snow day, so
oh, really?
I'm working from home.
There you go.
80 degrees.
We can relate to that. You are getting
80 degrees.
Yeah. All right. Carry on. CapEx. Cap gains. Sorry.
Yeah. So I work a lot with real estate owners and then also investors that make investments in private offerings. And so a lot of what I deal with is capital gains, structuring deals so that their investors try to get capital gains as opposed to ordinary income. So something that I'm always keeping an eye on, given the Republican sweep, I don't expect capital gains rates to go up. Capital gains treatment is usually something that's been important to the Republican base, and it's been more of the Democrat base that has wanted to increase capital gains. I think, but along those lines, what this administration is going to do with its tax cuts and its spending, it's going to need to find revenue somewhere. Recall that from the 2017 TCGA, the reason why a lot of these provisions are going to sunset, or scheduled to sunset in a year, is because the administration in 2017 couldn't find a way to pay for all these tax cuts. So they couldn't make them permanent. They had to put in a sunset provision. So I think there's going to try to find other ways to increase the revenue. It will, even though it won't be from capital gains rates increase. I think that there's going to be more of a focus on how are certain assets taxed. There's still pending regulations and guidance on how cryptocurrency and things like NFTs get taxed. So instead of affording those types of assets as being capital assets that get capital gain, look to see maybe a little bit of a push to increase the tax rates on some of those NFTs. And I put it in their oil and gas royalties. I meant to say oil and gas assets. I did notice, I watched Trump's acceptance speech after the election, and he only mentioned two policy issues. One was immigration and the border, and then the second one was protecting oil and gas drilling. So maybe there might be some opportunities to increase some of the taxes if there is increased oil and gas production there. And another part of that with the capital gains is that the Biden administration just announced within the past couple of weeks that they're giving they're growing their large partnership audit division. It is believed that if the IRS stepped up its enforcement of partnerships, which is where a lot of the capital gains flows through, that there's potential billions of dollars in tax revenue that's not being paid that they could get back. However, I think Trump's administration is less likely to keep funding the IRS at the levels that it has been in the past year to 2 years. And so there may not be the ability to go audit all of these large partnerships and determine if they're incorrectly reporting capital gain. And along the same lines with capital gains is this basis step up at death. So when someone dies with an appreciated asset, the heirs get to take that asset with a basis equal to the fair market value at death. So parents bought some property for $100. When they die, it's worth $1 million. The heirs get a basis of $1 million, and there's no gain if they were to sell it right away. There's been talk over the past few years about getting rid of this so that the heirs have to pay the taxes when the property gets sold. I don't expect this to go away in the next 4 years because, again, it's been a Republican base to keep that on. And also, if they're not going to fund the IRS the way that they expect to, then the burdens of it trying to administer the basis adjustments would be too difficult.
So I have this unenviable position of like keeping it moving because I want to go into all your topics, but I'm going to keep it moving. So, Greg, you're up.
Hi, Greg Wilder. I'm with Exemplar Law. I'm a tax attorney and CPA. Spent most of my career leading private client practices for big international accounting firms. But the two main things.
Let's pause on that one.
Yeah.
Because 361 firm. The one firm comes from Arthur Anderson.
Yes. It was on our logo.
That was a global collaborative culture. We have two former Anderson partners here today.
The one thing I wanted to focus on is going to be a little bit different. I'm not going to really follow per se the materials you'll have here on afterwards, but been doing this for 42 years. I focus mainly on two things. A lot of what like Abby and some of the other presenters talked about, a bunch of high-end multi-generational estate planning and a lot of exit planning, people looking to monetize and liquidate their assets. Regardless of who's in power, that there's no way to stop that wave. I was speaking at a FICPA conference on Monday, and the statistics are just startling. There's something like 8 trillion of wealth that's going to transfer between now and 2030, regardless of who's in power. And I think one of the things that the new administration is going to facilitate with the decrease, I saw another amazing statistic last night on Fox News about how deregulation and the lack of administrative regulations are going to facilitate more transactions. Let's just say transactions. So if you go back and focus on what's likely to happen, I know Stephen and I had a little bit of a debate yesterday about whether we're going to and when we're going to have a tax bill. I'm in the camp there's going to be a major bill at least introduced in the first 90 days. And I think something's going to be passed in the first 6 months. Other people say maybe not because border control and economy and things, but everything we talk about here, inflationary pressures, tariffs are inflationary. That's not technically a tax in my opinion, but there's going to be so much pressure on at least maybe not necessarily raising revenue, but I want to go back to 2021. If you look at August of 2021, Biden had just been in office 8 months. They were trying to pass massive legislation, things I'm going to talk about in a minute, from the Democratic camp. He had a Senate majority. But it took 2 senators, Senator Sinema from Arizona and Senator Manchin, neither of whom are in power anymore, who held up and blocked that bill. It turned into the infrastructure bill in November 15th of 2021, $60 billion of spending. They were going to pay for it with tax cuts. it didn't pass. They had to roll back most of that. What I'm going to say now is, okay, there may be 53 Republicans in control of the Senate. All it takes is a few holdouts, and we don't know where the House is going to end up. And you're going to have certain things that are really open to horse trading. And one of my mentors and the guy that ran our national tax office for 40 years at Arthur Andersen had a saying, which I've used my whole career. There's two things you never want to see made. One is sausage and one is tax law. And I've seen 10 provisions passed. And in the Biden administration alone, there was 4 major tax bills. And they were not tax bills alone. They were used to support, or at least ostensibly support, raising revenue to offset the Inflation Reduction Act. They attached it to the bill to fund Ukraine. They attached it to the bill to fund Israel. They attached it to the infrastructure bill. So it's a tool that's absolutely going to be used, whether it's strictly tax related or not. The things I would pay the most attention to are things that there's going to be some horse trading on. And the reason I say there's going to be horse trading, think about some of the things some of the speakers said before, qualified business deduction, the 199, the SALT deduction, qualified opportunity zones, 1031 exchanges. They affect millions of people, not thousands of people, but it's the top 1%. 95% of the people in this room are affected by the tax proposal changes, not 95% of the voters. 1% of the taxpayers pay 90% of the taxes. So the things they can easily do to raise revenues are going to be targeting a small number of voters. Those would be things like carried interest. Carried interest doesn't affect a large number of people, but it's a big revenue raiser. Same thing with 1202 stock. It only applies to C Corp owners and only a certain number of them, and the rules are very restrictive. So they can easily tweak those up. 1202 itself has been changed. It's been around for 20 years, but it never became of utility until 10 years ago because they kept increasing the benefits. They could easily scale back those benefits. So I think we're going to see some major changes. There'll be some things even the Republicans aren't going to be able to get through. I do not think we're going to have any major tax rate increases, but I also don't think we're going to have a lot of tax rate decreases. There'll be some things that pass. I just want to quickly run through, if you could just scroll up a little bit, Mark, some of the Democratic proposals on the second page, not really the tax rates, but down under the state and gift. These, just a little bit down. Yeah, right there. These things have been around since the Clinton administration, and in every Democrat, and these come right out of Biden's, what they call the Green Book. And the Green Book is what is their wish list of government. And this was something Harris never said she formally adopted, but she also said on The View, which I don't think is where I get most of my information, but she said, I can't think of a thing I would change, right? So this is in the Democratic proposal. So there could be things. I don't think they're going to reduce the gift exemptions that Abby talked about. I think we've got 28 million for a married couple right now to use. It's the most powerful gunpowder out there for estate planning.
Wait,
I think
1,000 or million?
million. Did I say 1,000? Yeah, million. Yeah, 28 million. And that's the gunpowder we use for almost all these planning techniques. They were talking about raising the estate tax rate as high as 65% on those over 100 million. They were talking about reducing your gift tax exemptions to back to 10,000. That's what it was, in the 1990s.
So why do you talk about this? That's not.
Because I think it's some of those things that could be used as a giveaway to basically, and the other reason I talk about it, we've got midterm elections coming up in just 2 years. There's 20, I think, Republican senators up and only 13 Democrats. All it takes is a flip of 4 or 5 of those and you can have this 2 holdout situation. So we really got 1 year. The real reason I'm bringing this up, I think we got 1 year where we know what the law is going to be, and it's going to be very favorable for estate and gift planning and income tax planning and exit planning. After that, I think we're back in play as to what could happen, because it could take an easy flip of the House. If things don't go Trump's way in the first 2 years and all these promises don't come through, we could easily have a split House again. And that's my point. He's going to be in place for 4 years. We know that. And like somebody said, you may not be around in 4 years. You got to look at what Vance is proposing too. Let's not forget about that. But I think we're going to have about 2 years of somewhat certainty, which is the reason I think we're going to have some massive tax changes quickly. And I also think my message is do as much planning as you can afford to do over the next 2025. That's my
So if we're going to turn to international, you actually have an international set of slides, if I remember. Let me just put that up. Can you talk about the international side? Then we're going to go to you, Peter. And
yeah, I'll let them talk more about it. That was really more for just international type proposals. That's not the area I focus on that much. So I'll let others talk more to the cross-border issues, because I think that's a great question. I was going to ask our first speaker, using tax policy for international. implications. There's been a lot of discussion about not just, you talked about tariffs, but there's other issues too about rates and rate reductions, incentives to domesticate more businesses back into the U.S. Everybody's becoming more isolationist now. That's the whole thing besides tariffs. I'm just curious what the views of the world are from control risk too, on tax policy and international. So I have more of a question than I do comment there.
I got you. All right. So then Peter and Amy, do you want to give some more broader view? Speaking of Vance taking over, like who takes over the Senate seat? Is that do you think DeWine takes Husted? Do you have a view on that? I'm from Ohio, so.
Not off the top of my head, no.
Put it on your radar. This is an Ohio thing for us. All right, Peter, over to you.
Yeah, so, thank you for letting me speak today. I guess, we've been talking a lot about tax policy, and I think the most important thing is Trump is trying to bring everything back to the United States. So under TCJA, he increased what I'll call the anti-deferral regimes, which were discouraging U.S. companies and individuals in keeping their money offshore. I'm sorry, I think, am I coming through okay?
You're good?
Okay, because my computer's saying I'm not. So
Your volume's here.
okay, good. So the existing structures that were in place under the anti-deferral regimes, one was a PFIC regime, which we're going to hear a little bit more from Amy, and the other one was Subpart F. And this was really trying to get at related party transactions and keeping money offshore and having that money come back in and being taxed in the United States, regardless of whether any distributions occurred. What we saw under TCJA was an expansion of that. We have these terms now that are called GILTI, which stands for Global Low Tax Intangible Income, FDII, which stands for Foreign Derived Intangible Income, BEAT, which is again something called base erosion anti-tax avoidance. And one of them is a stick and one of them is a carrot. And what they're all trying to do is to encourage investment in the United States and discourage investment or movement of assets outside of the United States to take advantage of a lower tax rate. So the one that we've been seeing, the most activity on is how do we handle this guilty tax? And in essence, boiling this down, a very complicated area to what I'll call layman's terms. If you're earning income greater than a 10% return on your tangible fixed assets outside the United States says we're going to tax you on it. Period, end of discussion. So, you're having, technology companies which have very little fixed assets overseas, I should say tangible fixed assets overseas, being hit with a nice sized tax and really no cash to pay it.
Peter, did you see the Russians' tax bill on Google?
I did. That's what I'm going to say is the guilty tax. But Russia too. I mean, everybody's saying, how can we get our fair share? And similarly, if you have technology in the United States and you're licensing it or selling it abroad, we're going to give you an incentive. So instead of paying 21% tax, from a corporate perspective, we're going to tax that at around 12%. So all these things came into play in TCJA. And as we've been discussing, all these things are expiring. So what do I think is going to happen? I think first, I think these regimes are going to stay in place. I think that the rates which are scheduled to go up are going to go up. And the question is, are they going to go up per the expiration, or are they going to go up, even more? And I think, as mentioned earlier, I think this is an area in which we can have some horse trading because it goes hand in hand with, I'm going to call the tariff regime. How can we disincentivize outside investment? So I do think GILTI and FDII and as a base erosion are here to stay. The other piece that I wanted to talk about is something called transfer pricing. Transfer pricing has been in the law. It's a tax law for many years. And it's something that the United States historically hasn't made what I'm going to say a compliance requirement. It's always been there, and it's only the large companies that we hear about, the Amazons, the Googles, the Starbucks, who, are dealing in this global trade and transferring goods outside the United States at unfair rates to take advantage of a lower tax rate in another jurisdiction. So, the government requires you to have studies done. But in the United States, as I mentioned, that's not compulsory. If you have the audit and you don't have the documentation, they hit you on the backside. I think that's something that certainly the IRS and the government has started to focus more resources on, and we're seeing more and more compliance and audits on this area. I think that's also going to go up. I think we're going to see an increase in compliance in this area, and maybe even making it mandatory. Okay, because again, it goes to the point, we're dealing with a small amount of companies with a large revenue pool. So I think that's where we're going to see, some focus in the current administration. The last topic I wanted to just touch on is something, again, also that's focused on a small group of corporate companies, and that's the corporate alternative minimum tax. So just going globally, the OECD countries, they've been focusing for the last number of years on what's called Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, which is similar to kind of the U.S. tax law. And what it's trying to do is say, first, we're attacking profit shifting, which I just talked about. So R, guilty, FDII, B, these are all things the U.S. Put into place. Their Pillar 1 was profit shifting. So that's how the OECD is looking at it. So those are similar kind of regulations. And there's 140 countries, in the OECD that have adopted Pillar 1. Pillar 2 is what's called the global minimum tax. So like the global minimum tax, they're saying that every company should pay, a minimum 15% tax. So the corporate alternative minimum tax is our way of saying Pillar 2, but they're very different. And I think the corporate alternative minimum tax is only applicable to companies that have more than $500 million of revenue. Again, a small group of companies, I think that what we're going to see is possibly Trump reducing the corporate rate, but also trying to play games with the corporate alternative minimum tax by dropping that 500 down. And the number that's been talked about is dropping it down to 250 million. So those are the areas I think that, again, I think the compliance regime in the international world is only going to get greater. We're seeing, as I said, a lot of activity in audits of both high net worth individuals and businesses that are doing cross-border transactions. And the area where I see, the most relevant to everybody in this room is you see a lot of PE firms that are investing in structures where, people are getting these K1s now that have lots of foreign issues buried in them. And keep an eye out for that, because I think that's where we're going to see a lot more audits coming in the future. But from a revenue perspective, this is a huge area. Sometimes the penalties are more than the tax. So, another revenue raiser.
Any questions to Peter before we switch? Yeah.
Anthony, go ahead.
Just on the last thing you said, the audit of the recipient of that K1 or the entity that's creating the K1. When you said an increase in audit.
We're seeing on both sides. So what generally happens is a high net worth individual is the target. And as a result of that, they find that there's an issue with a particular entity, and then it comes down to that entity.
Oh, so for them, it's
it comes either way.
They get it both sides, right?
Yes.
So it's a trigger and a red flag effect.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So, Peter, individuals, not corporations, but even in pass-through companies, we're not talking about 500. So I deal with a lot of international investors. And one of the whole things we always struggle with is the US will tax you if you make money in Australia, and it's still in Australia. We're the only developed country I know of that does that. So if you are Italian and make money on Fifth Avenue and you leave it on Fifth Avenue, you may have to pay something to the IRS, but you don't have to pay anything to the Italian government unless you bring it back. So you mentioned something about the low tax. Two things. You mentioned something about a low tax diversionary tactics, and you mentioned about higher enforcement. Which way is this going? Because it's pushing investment away from the US, from people who can. And on the other hand, so you just take it from there.
Yeah, what I would say is, if you're a foreign investor, invest in the United States, there's plenty of techniques to prevent taxation, meaning your direct taxation through blocking structures.
Yes,
But
my question
US
was
people-
for Americans. Yes.
US people, being forced to invest outside the United States, that's the area where I'm going to say that the Republicans and the current law discourages that. It discourages that because it's taxing you currently, even though you're not getting cash. It's an anti-deferral regime. So the US individual puts money in China, okay? He doesn't have any cash, but the Chinese entity is making money.
Right.
That's being taxed
What I
currently.
see more commonly is the US company that wants to expand outside the United States and is being horribly penalized for that.
Let's
Yes, no?
let's pause on that. We go deeper in the breakout. We have
Perfect, thank
one
you.
more speaker and we have lunch in the kitchen.
Great.
So, Amy?
Yeah.
Um,
Great to be here.
last-
Really nice segue with what Peter's got to say. I'm going to talk a little bit about individuals who want to invest outside of the U.S., particularly germane today with the results of the election and some folks looking for a plan B for where they might want to live instead of the U.S. So I specialize in Portugal's Golden Visa. It's a residency by investment program, and in servicing American investors investing in Portugal. I'm going to talk to you about PFIC, which was mentioned by Peter. That's a passive foreign investment company. It's essentially having to pay phantom gains on investments overseas. How you can avoid that a little bit, how you can ensure capital gains treatment rather than the highest ordinary income by choosing a qualified electing fund and year one of a PFIC. Controlled foreign corporations, we'll touch on that, and that flows into GILTI, which I think Peter covered really well. So the main focus right now is PFIC. It's been in place since 1986. I don't see it changing, but I leave that to the other experts on the call. Essentially, if you are investing in a vehicle overseas that has more than 75% of gross income as passive, and at least 50% of the assets are investments, it is a passive foreign investment company. And for the definition of this, funds do qualify as corporation. Next slide, please. So if you do not elect a qualified electing fund in year one of your investment into a PFIC, you will be taxed at the highest possible rate of personal income tax on any gains on that fund. It will create an absolute mess for your taxes. And so it is really important to select QEF in year one so that you can preserve capital gains treatment. In order to do that, you're paying phantom tax on gains. And in order to pay that phantom tax on gains, you will have to have annual statements from the fund in which you've invested. And so it's really important from a compliance perspective to have it enshrined in the operating documents of the fund that they will service U.S. investors with annual statements and be compliant with U.S. laws, including having banking partners that are FATCA compliant. Happy to advance, Mark. This is just what I had just covered, and happy to share this primer with anyone who might like to have it by email. Next. Yep, that's what should be in the information statement. So if anyone wants to get really in the nitty gritty with having things codified in the operating agreement of funds, there's some information that'll help you do that. Controlled foreign corporations are such that 50% of the total combined voting power in the foreign corporation is owned by Americans. That effectively domesticates some compliance issues with CFCs, and CFCs will flow into GILTI if certain thresholds are hit. Those are outlined here, and just for interest of time, I'll spare you going through them, but you're welcome to the primer if you'd like. There's a summary slide coming up. Next. Yeah, there you go. So this gives you a summary overview of PFIC, which is a phantom tax for foreign passive gains, how you can preserve capital gains treatment through a QEF election, what CFC treatment is, which you want to avoid. Some funds could be CFCs if they're owned dominantly by Americans, and then how that flows into GILTI.
And there's you.
There I am. Nice to be here with y'all today.
So we've hit, well, first, any questions to Amy and or Peter on these subjects, international subjects?
Well, I just want to bring up the concept that many people don't understand is the PFIC, what is a PFIC? And we tend to look at PFICs, from the US very different from how I'm going to call it a layperson who has an investment understands what a PFIC is or a CFC is. So
have your ear here.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. So what I would just say is that whenever you're considering an investment, or whether you're an advisor or an individual, you really have to ask the question, what is the U.S. tax treatment of this investment? And for example, a mutual fund investment outside of the United States could give rise to a tremendous amount of PFIC issues. And so I just bring that up to say, if you know nothing, about tax law, but you know about investments, consider whenever you're investing out of the United States to pass that by an advisor.
Yeah, I agree. And as you alluded to earlier, Peter, the compliance issues and the penalties, and it's designed so that the penalties are punitive, right? And would discourage these foreign investments. They will far outweigh the gains and often any of the benefits in making that investment.
Thanks.
Fair enough. In all disclosure, we're partners on the same broker-dealer platform. So if you invest in one of our funds, which has its own returns, there's the benefit of Portugal. Your optionality, as you're calling it. Some people, I've been surprised by how many people have second passports through this Golden Visa program. Wish that they knew Amy. Then she offers different ways to do that. What I really like, Peter, when I met your colleague Eric, is that you also is the treatment of how family offices are treated as an entity. That's its own subject. I don't know. Do you think that will change at all, or is that too nuanced with all this between the two camps?
I don't think that's going to change. I mean, high net worth individuals, family offices have very different issues. I mean, they're treated more as corporations in how we view them because they're invested in so many different vehicles. So you have to have a holistic approach to it. I don't think that's going to change.
And it's a lot of that structuring that we do in that area is based on case law, not based on legislative changes.
Fair enough. Well, we have food in our kitchen. Those are on Zoom. I would suggest stick around. We're likely to move in two different rooms, or we will have a continuation discussion. If they want to allow them to grab some food, bring it back in.
Can I just make one comment? We didn't talk about one thing I think is really important, and Peter touched on this, is the role of the IRS in all this. I think everybody on this panel would probably agree. The IRS commissioner who came in during the Biden administration is really trying to, I'm going to use the word weaponize the IRS, but they're using what was given to them in the Inflation Reduction Act. And again, nothing to do with taxes, but this was one of the things that got tucked in there. The IRS was given $80 billion. $40 billion of that was to modernize, which is absolutely necessary. I think they're the most backwards organization I think I've ever worked with. The other $40 billion was supposed to be on enforcement. They've only spent $2 billion of that at this point. I think that's a target of cutbacks, but they've proven with the people they have hired that for every $1 million I think they spend on new agents and enforcement, they're bringing in 10 to 15 million. So it would make sense to hire more agents, right? But here's a statistics that's interesting. I think it was the year ending February 2024, after the Inflation Reduction Act came in, the IRS's goal was to hire 38,000 new agents. Now, you got to understand, they've gone from 120,000 people to about 80,000 in the last decade. They've needed funding. There's no question. Of that 80,000, 50,000 of them are scheduled to retire in the next 5 years. Scary. Their budget was to hire 38,000 agents. Guess how many they hired in the first year? 3,800. 3,800. Nobody wants to work for the IRS anymore. They're broken. I think we'd all agree with that. So that's something to really keep in mind. I personally believe we're going to see a new IRS commissioner once we get the new Treasury Secretary, probably within 2025.
Is there also a bill from the Republicans to defund the IRS?
There will be, I think. There has been. There was pushback on that in the Inflation
That's
Reduction.
what I remember, yeah.
It's kind of funny because, the Republicans don't like audits. They don't like to get audited, but they know that they need to raise revenue too. But they've been the ones more guilty than the Democrats of cutting back the funding over the years, which is kind of interesting.
Well, we don't have to stop the discussion.
No, I'm just saying I think that's an important point.
Those who want to go grab some food, we can continue.
And we are operating back there, so if you just keep the volume down when you're in, get the food and bring
Grab
it back in
food
here.
and come back as soon as you can.
Thank you.
Hey,
Don't forget.
Greg, do you mind a follow-up question?
Yeah, go for it. We can keep the discussion going.
So given that the public markets were up really high as a result of the election, and there's been considerable gains for folks in the public markets this year, and we're in Q4, people are looking for offsets for some of those gains. And so do you have any strategy to offer that might be unique to this moment in time for deductions and offsets for gains?
The answer is absolutely, but
Did you guys coordinate that question?
yeah.
Thank you for asking.
What do you mean coordinate?
Like she gave you
No.
she gave you a softball question there.
No, but
I'm sorry to know, but everything's.
very few things can help significantly with long-term capital gains unless you're in a state like California and New York, which has an 11 or 12% flat tax on top of the capital gain rate. If you go back and look at the capital gain rate, minimum 20%. If you're subject to net investment income tax, you're up to like 24%. Now you stack on state rates, you're up to 36%. Some of these strategies can offset and give you 50% deductions against your AGI.
Yeah.
Much more powerful for an ordinary income person, particularly business income, anything that's ordinary, because the rate
Right.
is what matters. But yes, there's still some things that we're using pretty regularly. Of course, there's only 5 more weeks left to basically have people invest in
Hurry up.
things because we're coming to the end of 2024.
Yeah.
That's a whole separate tax policy, because we were talking about tax policy in the future, but there's still time to do some things this year, absolutely. Yeah.
And is that 50% AGI deduction a non-cash charitable gift, or is that another strategy for that?
It's something very different. It's similar to a conservation easement, but it's not.
Got it.
It's not listed.
That's good.
Yeah, it's not. It's a replacement for that. And we did that last year with a lot of people, but it doesn't involve real estate and it's nothing listed, but it's the same economic effect.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Now, that's pretty powerful. You think about somebody who's an athlete or an ordinary income earner, if you can tell them they can offset half their tax. We still have that. And I think, all these good ideas, they have a shelf life before the IRS starts attacking them. And they generally go on for 5 to 10 years. And then look at what happened with the multi pension plans. We're not talking about that, but
That makes perfect sense. But with the overview that you gave of the IRS situation, it seems like, strike while the iron's hot.
they have limited accesses, but when they get a hold of something, they dig their teeth in like a dog on a bone.
Let me just add, Bill or anyone else have questions? You got a great opportunity here. Bill, he's going to unmute. He's going to ask a question. I sense that.
Yeah, I've got a kind of a high level, big picture question.
Okay.
That would be interesting to hear from the unique audience that you've got in the room there. Given what's, the result of the elections, and also I thought it was very interesting that Mike Johnson was on the platform for Trump's victory speech. Also that, there's a potential for Rick Scott to become the majority leader in the Senate. Two, very non-Republican Republicans. So that plus, my view is that the Democratic Party has completely decapitated itself and is going to have a tough time organizing any type of minority resistance. What do you all think as far as, being able to put through policy in a way that we've never seen it before in the first year? And I know some of you have talked about that, but it seems to me that this could be like the true golden opportunity for Republicans and Trump in particular to put through his wish list with very little opposition.
Can I ask Al, because you have your finger on some of that pulse, Al Puhala.
Yep. You
Then we'll
know,
go around.
I think the moment is going to be met. You know, there's a window. Surprise took everyone going. I have a feeling there'll be a window here to move a large piece of legislation, and also in order to, especially through reconciliation. You know, my lane is opportunity zones, but that was done through reconciliation, right, back in 2017. So it's kind of, you know, back to the future. But you know, the Republicans, especially thinking out of the box, you know, I believe something like opportunity zones, maybe some tax reform, maybe something with tariffs, whatever it's going to be. You only can pick 2 or 3 things because that's all you get. I think they're going to be put on the table, rammed through as a kind of one-off. What I'm hoping on zones happens is basically this magnet for, you know, all the foreign capital. If you want to come in here and help build American jobs, you know, come into a zone, get a tax break. Just yesterday, there were some zone proposals floating around. You know, people like Ben Carson, Governor DeSantis, they're all huge zone proponents. So I think you're going to see a massive, you know, set of legislation. You know, my widget, which is the zones, are going to be part of it because it's infrastructure, national security, low-income communities in rural America. But yeah, I think there's a moment, and everyone's looking to get into it very fast.
Others with insights?
I agree with that, but one thing we didn't touch on is the budget reconciliation process. You can pass tax legislation with 50% plus majorities, not 60% if you have both parts of Congress agreeing. I personally think we're going to see a very quick extension of the TCA from 2017. The reason they typically only go out 9 years is that's all they're allowed to do under the budgetary reconciliation process. If they do have a stalemate, they're not going to get that passed, but I don't think that's going to happen. Someone made the point, even some of the Republicans or, you know, they call them the rhinos, or are they really Republicans? We don't know, but I think so. We got a lot of new ones coming in. But the point's going to be, I think you can do it quickly with a simple 50% majority here in the next 3 to 6 months. And if they do nothing else, they'll probably extend everything out another 9 years. And again, it's subject to change under a new administration at some point. But I think, like you just said, I think they'll take things like opportunity zones that are set to sunset and expand them, or make them. I've even heard there was potential legislation to allow qualified opportunity zones to create fund of funds, where you don't necessarily just have to invest your proceeds in one business, but you can invest in a fund that would be investing in a bunch of businesses. So
no, that's exactly right. And by the way, if you go back and read the 544 pages of tax regs that Secretary Mnuchin came out, it had all that structure, 381 triangular mergers. I mean, there's a whole, you basically have the best set of regulations ever, and I think in the government over that 2-year period, and it's sitting there, it's the law. All you have to do is just turn it on with, especially new subsidies.
It would not be hard because it's not new concepts. It's really just extensions or enhancements of existing law.
Yes.
Anyone else want to hit that question or ask other questions? And this is your opportunity. You got all these people that aren't charging you right now.
Mark, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So Kim Akusha, I'm at a single family office based here.
Audio.
It was muted.
All right.
And so we invest through DAFs, our advised funds, into VC funds, and also starting to do some direct investments into founders. So I'm curious, just an open question, anybody can really take it, your thoughts on donor advised funds, any kind of regulations that you see upcoming, because there's something about $300 billion underutilized capital in the DAFs. The banks are charging 1% fees, right? Obviously, the downside from the offices, you can't withdraw that cash. But just kind of, again, open question to anybody really, what are your thoughts around DAFs, any kind of regulations, laws coming in the pipeline? And what kind of opportunities you see there?
I work with 3 charities. I'm not a tax guy, if you want an opinion. It's from that perspective. Mark, yes? Okay. So, DAP, you get the write-off when you put the money in. Now it depends what you want to do with it. So a lot of it just does sit there. And as you're right, charge a fee, so you got your tax write-off. Now what? So what I hear from the charities, I'm not the marketing end of anything, is that they're having a lot of trouble getting that money to move at all. Like you said, you invest in VCs. That's an exception from what I've heard. I'm not saying no one does it. I'm saying no one does it as this is what we're going to do plan. And it's really all over the map. And the nonprofits are really struggling to figure out how to get their hands around DAFs. And then it's a disconnecting, let's say, I'll just pick Fidelity, I'm picking on them. They're a huge provider of DAF services, for instance, but they are not connected to any network or process of these, potential targets, charities. So, and then of course, a certain percentage, if you're investing in VCs or for-profit. So there's rules and conflict of interest stuff, and I'm not against all that stuff, but that's the general, sort of picture that I've been told by the three organizations that I try to help.
I have someone that might be interesting to talk to that might have more clarity on this guy named Tony Suber. He has a SDG.
Just introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Jimmy Mariolos. Nice to meet you all. So I do a couple things. I'm a fractional chief revenue officer at an AI company in the capital market space. We created fully AI turnkey trading systems and the first fully AI ETF in the New York Stock Exchange. Working with this is part of mine that ran the private balance sheet of Wells, and he created 4 separate billion-plus revenue businesses from scratch. So really interesting risk-adjusted returns, and have an opportunity in one space to do that again. So we're in capital and also in private investments. But Tony, he's a really interesting guy. He worked at Notre Dame. Did some really interesting structures around DApps, and I think he has $10 billion in his portfolio. I could be wrong on that, but he's looking at unique ways in which to connect the ecosystems and unlock value utilizing that structure to your point. So there might be interesting persons trying that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, nice to meet you. It's Amy. I dig deep into the DAF world and fiscally sponsored programs to channel DAF money into for-profit opportunities that are impact oriented. So I'm really excited by your question. As far as I know, legislatively, there is a movement to try to require a 5% minimum distribution annually from DAFs to match the requirement for foundations. It hasn't passed yet, but there is a movement in that direction. It seems like that might be the only thing that gets the money flowing out of DAFs and into the market. There's about, as you mentioned, like $250 billion just sitting like monopoly money in DAFs that folks kind of forget about because they've already taken the tax deduction for that quasi donation that's sitting sort of just in a holding tank. So there's a perverse incentive with the DAF sponsors, right, who are taking up a fee for assets under management. Why would they encourage distribution of those funds if they're making money on those fees? So it seems like the legislative change is really what's going to get that to move if and when that ever happens. But in the meantime, there are your classic fund sponsors like Fidelity Charitable that was mentioned earlier. Charles Schwab is another, and they can do investments inside of that, but only in their own ecosystem, and they don't tend to permit, as you may well know, permit investments that are outside of their own funds, for example. But there's a growing class of smaller DAF sponsors that actually do not only permit, but encourage those investments into impact opportunities through either the DAF sponsor or the 501c3 itself taking an LP position in impact funds, aggregating DAF monies into that, essentially an SPV in a way, right? And then taking the investment and then either distributing the gains back out to the initial donors to their DAFs, or maybe it's an evergreen where that money rolls back in to more programming. So that's a growing field. And if you're looking for anyone in that world, I'd be happy to connect you. But it's a topic that I really enjoy chatting about. So I'll connect with you on LinkedIn and maybe we can continue the discussion.
Sounds great.
To continue on that, hey, we connected on LinkedIn after the Tuesday call. I've got a family that is looking at that as a vehicle. So definitely would love to speak with you offline. And Amy, sounds like I need to talk to you as well offline. So well, I've got that as a to-do item on my notes. But thank you.
Yeah, I just put my email in the chat, so happy to connect with both of you.
She worked with Peter Lupo. You guys remember Peter? Other questions?
We put that question on hold, strategies about the gains from this year.
Okay, go ahead. You wanna-
No, I'm just, I'm looking to learn about what are the strategies to offset the gains.
Chris, you were talking about capital gains. Can you come back on? You're around? Or anyone else? I'm sure it's, several other people can talk about that again. Well, what's the general, is there a specific question or just a general?
There was a question posed by someone. The market is going up. There will be those new capital gains. What are the strategies to offset these capital gains with any of the tools that we discussed today? That was the question, and we put that question on hold until people will get back.
Anyone want to touch on that?
I mean, this is Al Puhala at Capstone. I mean, one of the strategies people use in culling their portfolios before year end is sell, appreciated assets, any assets, stock, bonds, real estate, your stamp collection. And then you have 180 days like a 1031, but any gain to any type of investment that's in the zone. So a lot of folks I know are considering, exiting assets right now and then having until next June, if you will, 180 days later to invest potentially in their own fund, someone else's fund, multi-asset, single asset. But that's why you have today $220 billion. Elon Musk has been selling his Tesla stock, putting it in his fund and doing SpaceX. He has to do an SEC filing to say it. So my only point is there are lots of strategies, but there are very few that have that flexibility like a 1031 or an opportunity zone.
Yeah, the thing I would say, the exit plan I do, Patrick and I have a potential client that we're working with that has got public company stock, but he was a founder and is looking at a 9+ figure exit. But most of the best planning strategies for things like that require 6 months or more to implement. They're very complex and you need a lot of new entity structures, charitable trusts, all kinds of things to basically offset that. But if you're talking about just taking the stock market gain, there's really not much you can do if you're talking about now between the end of the year. Now, if it's, a big exit of a business or a privately held asset, there's a lot of things you can, not even say a lot. There's still a lot you can do, but most of the best planning ideas for capital gains have to be done well in advance of that event. And that's part of the biggest challenge we usually have is getting the people to address it well before. A lot of times they'll go to their investment banker and they come to us with the letter of intent, the ink is drying and it's kind of too late if you follow what I'm saying. So it depends on what kind of capital gain. If you're just talking about taking stock market gains, unless you're in a high tax state, most of these other things generate deductions to offset the gains, but they don't necessarily move the needle as much if your rate's not high enough to make sense. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Aside from matching against losses, it's the same class of capital gains.
Yeah, the loss harvesting, like everybody's been doing for years.
The market for selling tax credits, how do you see that changing at all?
No discussion of it.
I have a client that utilizes the Connecticut film credit, and it can offset 50% of the state tax. It's a little bit harder at the federal level in terms of solar and new market tax credits have gone by the wayside, but there still are historic credits you can participate in. There's a lot of states that have state credits available. Colorado has something like the Opportunity Zone. There's other. Connecticut, from the individual perspective, has an angel credit that's available to offset 100% of the current income. And those usually trade at a discount. So you're buying a dollar's worth of April 15th tax or something less than that. And so, the rate of return for somebody buying a credit today is somewhere in the neighborhood of 20%, depending upon if you can stop making withholding in your first 2 quarters of 25, things like that. Right. So there are still some opportunities for that. It just, it's not giant. It's not whiz bang.
The general consensus is depending on the credit and what the fund is. Like Patrick said, best case investing 80 cents to save $1. More normal is like you're investing 90 cents to save $1. So it moves the needle, but it's, it's just like almost a guaranteed 10% return is the way I now look at it, 10 to 12%. So there's actually probably more opportunity in the state area because there's a lot of film credits. Done a lot with state planning and not estate, but state tax planning. But there's really been no discussion of targeting or changing those that I know.
I have an impact-focused nonprofit that's accepting the donation of illiquid securities. If you're looking for an offset on AGI and to clean up a portfolio of private securities that are viable but not scalable.
Not scalable meaning it's a one-off?
Say it again?
Not scalable, you're saying because it's like a one-off?
Just companies that don't fit into that VC boomer bust model, right? They're never going to IPO. They're not going to exit at a 10x, but they're also not going to zero. So you're just stuck holding this thing forever. And maybe VC funds have to wind up in year 10 or 12 and they're looking for a way to move along something that's never really going to fit their model. So there's a donation path for that.
What's the donating company going to do with it if it wasn't able to be built by the founders in the growth company?
Yeah, there are different definitions of successful, right? And so if it doesn't boom or bust, but it's a lifestyle company that does fine for a while, that's okay, right? Especially inside of a nonprofit. Is that what you mean?
They're going to run it and just sell it and monetize it to get the cash eventually? Is that what the long-term plan is?
Yeah, or it's an exit to employees, and you sell in secondaries to the company's employees, for example.
What's the best, any unique tax ideas you guys are thinking of otherwise that we may not be thinking about?
You just mentioned sale to the employees is a tremendous opportunity. The ESOP, you can utilize, if you're a C corporation, you utilize 1042. Everybody knows 1031 is the exchange of real estate, but 1042 gives the carryover basis. So somebody who's exiting a business does not recognize the capital gain or ordinary income on depreciation recapture. But in the right situation, it could be a tremendous opportunity. Depending upon what the exiting person wants to do, even in an M&A, traditional capital market kind of thing, selling to the employees and let the employees go out and do essentially an LBO, an employee LBO, the seller could conceivably turn that illiquid giant portion of their estate and or of their holdings into a myriad of other, and the term is qualified replacement property, but essentially a kind of an own little mini fund. So if you have, $1, $2, $3, $400 million company that you want to sell, and selling to a strategic or a family office or to an independent could present you with a significant gain. Selling to the employees or even part of the company selling to the employees could be aside from being a magnanimous thing, could actually be a better economic outcome.
One of the things we're using a lot nowadays, it's also a potential target. There's been articles written and attacks on private placement life insurance, but it's still one of the best things to use for an exit or a planning strategy. Insurance, I think, is probably the second strongest lobby besides the one that was mentioned earlier. They have always been a favorite vehicle under the tax code, and being able to have unlimited appreciation with no tax in the future is pretty powerful, but there's ways we can combine that with some of the other planning we do to avoid income and or estate tax on the exit itself. But Senator Ron Wyden, who's the ranking senior Senate Finance Committee member, which is the tax writing arm of the Senate, will no longer be in power. He just got a demotion, I guess. He's written articles and been on the warpath trying to change the rules. He thinks it's only for the wealthy. So, keep an eye on that too. But that is something we're using a lot. That's very little known about how powerful that can be.
It's the best marketing tool for you because it tells you that rich people are doing it.
And staying rich.
It works really, really, really well.
Right.
And we don't
want to close it down. Exactly.
So, if done properly, it follows, very, very well-founded, long-standing existing law that is, pretty hard to unravel.
No, he's been a great proponent for telling people to use it while it's here.
You know, it's kind of like the carry being in the green book for the last 20
Right.
years. Nobody likes the carry, but they know
How it works.
Yeah, so, you know, we can thank cinema for blowing it up last time, but I think that there'll be continued desire to leave it in from the capital markets and the private equity.
Well, certainly this administration will leave it in here.
Any other comments, questions?
I don't know if it's a planning idea, but I think one topic that no one's discussed is the R&D matter, which, you know, kind of, for those that don't know, the Tax Cut and Jobs Act kind of removed the ability for companies to deduct R&D immediately and capitalize it over 5 years. And that hurt a lot of companies. I think that's, you know, I hope I should say that the tax laws will change and revert that back.
Yeah, that's one that's already expired, basically, and they tried to attach it to several of the bills I referred to, just never passed. And it's going to stimulate more R&D in business, so I could see that definitely being put back in.
It's a great opportunity for startups. People don't realize the R&D in the first 5 years of companies can generate cash. So even offsetting payroll, and people don't, you know, in the grand scheme of things, they get lost in the muck of making their business, you know, when do we get to revenue? When are we, you know, when are we having our IPO? When are we, you know, and stuff like that. And if you're in your first couple of years, particularly if you're doing neat stuff, and even if you're not doing neat stuff, there's a lot of cool things with the research and development for new companies that get to allow them a cash flow.
That's a great point, that all the new companies, their first 5 years generate losses. They never think they have a tax issue, but when you can use something like that credit, you got a payroll. You can offset payroll taxes.
And can you two talk about specifically depreciation of IP? Because that's something that's come up in my world that's like, wow, this could be interesting.
I've heard it.
Acquired IP is generally a 15-year amortization.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, so it's, you know, that's a timing issue, and, you know, you spend $100, you're gonna get it divided over, you know, $7 a year, $8 a year for the 15 years. It's pretty hard to accelerate that because it doesn't go in with, but going back to 1202 and having companies start up and be corporations and invest, you know, you might be better off having it be a C corporation, take original stock than some of your other alternatives. And there's a lot of other neat things that you can do in terms of structuring your business and both acquiring from your standpoint, from funds, collaborating with the employee stock, with charitable remainder trusts, and getting something that's taxable or non-taxable into an area that's not taxable. And I just think that
That's where I'm going.
Is collaborating, splitting the company between, you know, a taxable entity and non-taxable entity. You know, there's, you know, Peter mentioned in the global world, I like Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands, and I think because of the 52nd and 53rd state, although we won't see DC becoming a state anytime soon, you know, you're not in some banana republic, but I think, you know, nobody talked about the state effect. I think that states are going to continue as the federal government machinates and wiggles through the next 4 years. We're going to have an opportunity from state planning. Obviously, a lot of the red states, Tennessee and Nevada and Texas and Florida, don't have an income tax. And so from an individual perspective, there's a tremendous opportunity there. But from business migration, Peter mentioned transfer pricing at the international or the global level, but there's actually transfer pricing at the state level. You have multiple manufacturing, you have, you know, intellectual property. You know, if you're acquiring IP or you acquiring IP in Florida and licensing out to other jurisdictions, there, you know, the original, you know, intercompany licensing and stuff was Jeffrey with Toys R Us, and people moving that money around trying to not pay tax on it. But if you're a Florida entity, or even better yet, maybe some other jurisdiction, or an entity that's not paying tax in California or New York, you know, you're very excited about the possibility of transfer pricing and moving things around. I have a client that just purchased California assets, but we purchased those assets in another jurisdiction, and they lease them. And so they're drawing some of that income back to the jurisdiction where they're not paying an income tax. California wants to say it's taxable to California, but they have other reasons that it's not. And so
how is that played out?
Sarah has a question. Go ahead, Sarah.
So it's not exactly a question. It was just another comment. I put on also on the Zoom chat a paper. People come up with ETF strategies also, but in order to, not get into the wash sale rules, they create ETFs of similar but different stocks. And this is how, they deal with the wash sale rules. And sometimes they also come with long and short ETFs, which they make a higher leverage on the long stocks, and then they make a short leverage, on some other ETFs. They sell the losing position. So they always have some kind of a tax loss, and this loss they can write against, maybe a gain in their business or a gain in their housing, etc. So there's a whole paper explaining that I put into the thing. So ETF in the chat, yeah, ETFs becoming a real strategy for tax planning. Different, similar but different stocks in ETFs. So it's not like you just sold the stock, realized the loss, and bought it again.
Our two of the last topics that brought up, they reinforce what I was saying earlier. Everybody has a perception that the 2017 TCJA was all pro-taxpayer and it was all driven by the Republicans. But we just mentioned two things that were in that bill that were actually anti-taxpayer. One was eliminating R&D credits. The other was the changes in 1031. We used to do planning before that where we got creative and could take intangible assets and sell businesses that had significant goodwill and built-in intangibles and use 1031. You can't do that anymore. That was legislated away in 2017. So that's my point is don't think everything's going to be nirvana with the tax bill as it passes. This is where the horse trading comes in, and any or all of these things are in play because we're in a deficit that nobody can ignore forever. That's the point. So there's going to be some things that come out that are surprises. And that's the only thing I'll predict is you can't predict Congress.